During a powerful moment in a public hearing, hearing, BTS member Jimin stood face-to-face with the CEO of a major entertainment company who had been accused of corruption and manipulation within the industry. But in an unexpected twist, Jimin revealed a truth so powerful it silenced the room and changed the course of the situation in his favor. What happened next left everyone speechless. The gavel hit the desk with a sharp thud. The room froze. Jimin, standing tall, locked eyes with the CEO of the company, who had just walked into the packed hearing room. Cameras flashed, and whispers filled the air. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. The whole world had been watching the trial, but no one expected this. Normally calm and composed, Jimin was visibly shaken. He stood up, breaking protocol, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "CEO," Jimin said, "this company is in possession of documents suggesting you've deliberately withheld critical information from the public." Gasps filled the room. Some reporters even dropped their pens from the gallery. The tension was palpable, but Jimin didn't flinch. He calmly interlocked his fingers, exuding a serenity that said, "I know something you don't." Then he looked up, his eyes shining not with fear, but with sadness. "If I tell the truth, it will not only change this trial, it will change everything. It will change this industry." The room held its breath. Jimin didn't respond immediately. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed letter. It seemed to have survived years in an old drawer. He held it up carefully. "This was written by a mother who died believing that justice had forgotten her," Jimin said, his voice breaking. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the crowd, and the CEO, who had been calm, blinked in disbelief. The letter was from a mother named Elena, who had lost her son, a young dancer named Luis Enrique, in what was described as a failed but classified operation. But it wasn't just a failure, it was a cover-up, a lie. Jimin continued, "I kept this letter not to protect myself, but to preserve the only truth this mother had left." He gently placed the letter on the podium as if it were sacred. "Before she died, Elena begged me to find the one responsible, and I did." The room was silent. A murmuring started from the back. "God help us, Jimin," said a voice from the audience. Jimin inhaled deeply. His hands shook slightly, but he clenched his fingers to hide it. He looked at the letter, then at the cameras, then back at the CEO. "This is absurd," he said, trying to sound firm. "The files are sealed for a reason. You are distorting the truth." But Jimin wasn't done. He walked to the table of evidence and opened a thin leather folder. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," he said, "but I won't stay silent while the truth is buried." He pulled out a photograph, blurred and taken from a distance, but unmistakable. The CEO was pictured standing next to a private contractor, the same one tied to the cover-up documents. The contractor had received millions in bribes from a fund authorized by the CEO. The CEO denied knowing him. Jimin's voice cut through the silence. "You know him," he said. "Don't deny it. The truth is right in front of you." The room stirred and a voice from the jury whispered, "She knows. She's been hiding it all along." The CEO stared back at Jimin, not with hatred, but with sorrow. "I didn't want this," Jimin murmured almost inaudibly. "I admired you." Jimin's words shattered the silence like a knife. "No, sir, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing," he said. "I'm keeping a promise to a grieving mother." Jimin looked at the grainy photo on the screen. His eyes searched for an escape in the room, but there was none. He spoke again, this time more slowly, deliberately. "This is a copy of a handwritten memo. It was recovered from the home of a former intelligence advisor who passed away 2 months ago. In it, you are named as the final signatory of a covert operation that was never passed to the assembly." He held it up for the cameras. No classified stamp, no redactions, just ink, just the truth. The CEO's lips pressed together. "You obtained this illegally," she whispered. Jimin took a step forward. "I obtained this from his widow," he said. "She begged me to tell the world what her husband gave his life to protect. She told me, please, don't let them forget, just like everyone else has been forgotten." From the back of the room, an older man began to sob. The silence became heavy. The young man who died in that operation, Jimin continued, was Luis Enrique. He was only 19. In his final letter to his mother, he wrote, "If I don't come back, I just want someone to tell the truth." At that moment, Jimin's words resonated with the crowd. A woman in the front row began to cry. Even a member of the jury wiped away a tear. Jimin placed a hand on the shoulder of the elderly woman, Mercedes, who was slowly making her way to the stand. She was Luis Enrique's grandmother. Her voice was soft but fiery. "My daughter died from the sadness," she said, voice trembling. "I've waited too long to see someone speak for Luis." She turned to the CEO. "You signed his death sentence and buried the truth so deep that no one could find it. But this man, Jimin, he unearthed it for us." Many people in the audience began to cry. Even the jury members wiped their tears. And for the first time, the world saw what a true leader looked like. During a powerful moment in a public hearing, BTS member Jimin stood before the CEO of a major entertainment company who had been accused of corruption and exploitation within the industry. But in an unexpected twist, Jimin revealed a truth so powerful that it silenced the room and shifted the entire situation in his favor. What happened next left everyone speechless. The gavel struck the desk with a sharp thud. The room froze. Jimin sat tall, locking eyes with the CEO of the company, who had just entered the packed hearing room. Cameras flashed, and whispers filled the air. This wasn't supposed to happen. The world had been following the trial for days, but no one had expected this. Jimin, usually composed and calm, seemed shaken. He stood up, breaking protocol, and his voice trembled. "CEO," Jimin said, "this company is in possession of documents suggesting you've deliberately withheld critical information from the public." Gasps filled the room. Some reporters even dropped their pens from the gallery. The tension was palpable, but Jimin remained unfazed. He calmly interlocked his fingers, exuding a quiet serenity that said, "I know something you don't." Then he raised his head. His eyes didn't shine with fear, but with sadness. "If I speak the truth, it will not only change this trial, it will change everything. It will change this industry." The room held its breath, as did the entire nation watching. Jimin didn't respond immediately. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, crumpled letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges, as though it had survived years in a forgotten drawer. He lifted it carefully. "This was written by a mother who died believing that justice had forgotten her," Jimin said, his voice cracking. A tear rolled down a woman's cheek in the audience, and the CEO blinked in disbelief. The letter was from a mother named Elena, who had lost her son, a young dancer named Luis Enrique, in what was described as a failed but classified operation. But it wasn't just a failure, it was a cover-up, a lie. Jimin continued, "I kept this letter not to protect myself, but to preserve the only truth this mother had left." He gently placed the letter on the podium as if it were sacred. "Before she died, Elena begged me to find the one responsible, and I did." The room was silent. From the back, a murmur arose. "My God, Jimin," came a voice from the audience. Jimin inhaled deeply. His hands trembled slightly, but he clenched his fingers to hide it. He looked at the letter, then at the cameras, and then back at the CEO. "This is absurd," he said, trying to sound firm. "The files are sealed for a reason. You are distorting the truth." But Jimin wasn't done. He walked to the evidence table and opened a thin leather folder. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," he said. "But I won't stay silent while the truth is buried." He pulled out a photograph, blurry and taken from a distance, but unmistakable. The CEO was pictured standing with a private contractor, the same one linked to the cover-up documents. The contractor had received millions in bribes from a fund authorized by the CEO. The CEO denied knowing him. Jimin's voice cut through the silence. "You know him," he said. "Don't deny it. The truth is right in front of you." The room stirred, and a voice from the jury whispered, "She knows. She's been hiding it all along." The CEO stared back at Jimin, not with hatred, but with sorrow. "I didn't want this," Jimin murmured almost inaudibly. "I admired you." Jimin's words shattered the silence like a knife. "No, sir, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing," he said. "I'm keeping a promise to a grieving mother." Jimin looked at the grainy photo on the screen. His eyes searched for an escape in the room, but there was none. He spoke again, this time more slowly, deliberately. "This is a copy of a handwritten memo. It was recovered from the home of a former intelligence advisor who passed away 2 months ago. In it, you are named as the final signatory of a covert operation that was never passed to the assembly." He held it up for the cameras. No classified stamp, no redactions, just ink, just the truth. The CEO's lips pressed together. "You obtained this illegally," she whispered. Jimin took a step forward. "I obtained this from his widow," he said. "She begged me to tell the world what her husband gave his life to protect. She told me, please don't let them forget, just like everyone else has been forgotten." From the back of the room, an older man began to sob. The silence became heavy. "The young man who died in that operation," Jimin continued, "was Luis Enrique. He was only 19. In his final letter to his mother, he wrote, 'If I don't come back, I just want someone to tell the truth.'" At that moment, Jimin's words resonated with the crowd. A woman in the front row began to cry. Even a member of the jury wiped away a tear. Jimin placed a hand on the shoulder of the elderly woman, Mercedes, who was slowly making her way to the stand. She was Luis Enrique's grandmother. Her voice was soft but fiery. "My daughter died from the sadness," she said, voice trembling. "I've waited too long to see someone speak for Luis." She turned to the CEO. "You signed his death sentence and buried the truth so deep that no one could find it. But this man, Jimin, he unearthed it for us." Many people in the audience began to cry. Even the jury members wiped their tears. And for the first time, the world saw what a true leader looked like. He died because someone ordered a last-minute change in the mission, a change that, we were told, came from the top. From the courtroom, Jimin saw Magistrate Velasquez's jaw tighten. "I held Luis's hand as he bled out," the soldier whispered. "Tell my mom it wasn't my fault. Tell her I did nothing wrong." People in the audience began to cry openly. Even a reporter lowered their camera to wipe away the tears. Jimin nodded softly. "Can you confirm that this is the record of the mission change?" he asked, extending the document. The soldier looked at it, his voice breaking. "That's it. That's the order that killed him." Velasquez collapsed into her seat. The judge looked shocked, and Jimin spoke a line that would echo throughout the nation that night. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. And El Salvador understood that this trial was no longer just about a courtroom. It was about the kind of country El Salvador wanted to be. That night, Jimin sat alone in his hotel room. The cameras had pursued him all day. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, but he needed a moment. He pulled out an old Bible, the one his grandmother gave him, the one he carried during the campaign. Between the pages of the Psalms was a photo of a young girl in uniform, a bright smile, short hair, and eyes full of dreams. Luis Enrique Chavez. Jimin stared at the photo, remembering the call he had received months ago from Doña Mercedes Chavez. "I know you're not just a politician," she had said, tears in her voice. "You're the son of a soldier, and that still means something." Jimin looked out the window. Protesters, fans, journalists. But all that occupied his mind was a promise. "I won't stop until the truth stands firm," he whispered. Back in the courtroom, Velasquez remained locked in her office, but outside, the world was changing. The pain of a mother had shattered the silence, and Jimin was no longer just a politician. He was the face of truth. The next morning, just before the hearing resumed, Jimin arrived early. He carried a simple manila envelope pressed against his chest with no labels, no seals, just the weight of paper. When the room filled, Jimin stood and calmly approached the podium. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "I have one last piece of evidence to present." Inside the envelope was a confession signed by the very contractor linked to the operation in which Luis Enrique died. The words were trembling but clear. "Magistrate Velasquez ordered me not to reveal that the equipment used in Operation Rio Hueco was faulty. She said it would ruin her chances of confirmation." A sigh swept through the room like a wave. Jimin turned to the judge. That equipment had been reported as faulty for months, but someone cut corners and concealed the reports to protect their rise to power. The judge leaned back in his chair, stunned. Velasquez's lawyers called for a recess, but the judge denied it. "What we need is transparency, not delay," he said. Velasquez remained frozen, her silence louder than any denial. Outside, in front of the monuments to veterans, Flags were lowered to half-mast. People no longer cried for just a soldier. They cried for the loss of justice. David Chavez, Luis Enrique's father, hadn't spoken publicly since his son's funeral. The pain had torn him apart in a way words couldn't explain. But now, with trembling hands, he stood at the witness stand. He looked at Jimin with eyes full of silent pain. "My wife asked for the truth," he said, his voice low, "and you gave it to her. She died believing no one would listen, but you did." The room fell into complete silence. David turned to Magistrate Velasquez. "When I shook your hand at the ceremony, you told me you were proud of my son's sacrifice. But now I know his death was just a smokescreen." Velasquez lowered her head, and David pulled something from his pocket. It was a crumpled note, the last letter from Luis Enrique. He read it with a broken voice. "Dad, if something happens to me, just know I tried to be brave. I love you and Mom." Jimin wiped away a tear, and in that moment, the room was no longer a political space. It was a sanctuary, a father, a letter, a son, and a nation that was finally listening. As David finished speaking, the room remained in absolute silence. Even the court officer wiped his eyes. The judge slammed his gavel down hard and looked directly at Magistrate Velasquez. "Velasquez has the right to respond to these accusations," the judge said, "but her silence will be interpreted as an acceptance of their truth." Velasquez opened her mouth, but no words came out, only tears. "I never wanted anyone to die," Jimin whispered, standing up with respect. "Intentions don't erase consequences," he said. "A family's loss should never have been buried to protect a career." The judge nodded slowly. Then he looked around the room. "This hearing is no longer just about ethics. It's about the integrity of our highest institutions. Let's proceed without delay." The people in the gallery stood, veterans, mothers, pastors, students. Outside, the cameras captured a crowd of thousands holding signs. They weren't protesting. They were remembering. Luis Enrique's life matters. Truth over power. "Thank you, Jimin." The story wasn't over, but El Salvador had already changed. Just when it seemed that the courtroom had seen it all, Jimin called an unexpected witness. A woman stepped forward, nervous, hands tightly clasped. She wasn't in uniform, but when she spoke, everyone leaned forward to listen. "My name is Sofia Portillo," she said. "I was the nurse at the military hospital in San Salvador the night Luis Enrique Chavez was admitted." Magistrate Velasquez looked up. Suddenly, a flash of panic crossed her face. Sofia continued, "He didn't die right away. He lived for 27 minutes. And during that time, he asked me one question over and over again. Did my mom know? Was I supposed to be there?" The room fell silent. Sofia wiped her eyes. She didn't understand what Luis Enrique meant until months later, when she overheard a conversation about changing a name on the mission list. Jimin asked softly, whose name was replaced. Sofia looked directly at Magistrate Velasquez. "Your nephews." The room filled with gasps. Jimin didn't move. He whispered, "Then you chose your family over hers." Velasquez closed her eyes, and millions watching from their homes understood in an instant. This wasn't just corruption. It was personal. After Sofia's revelation, the judge called for a brief recess, but Jimin remained standing next to the witness stand. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a small, carefully folded letter. "This is something I've never read aloud before," he said in a low voice. It was written by Doña Mercedes Chavez, Luis Enrique's grandmother. Just days before her death, she had opened the paper. Her voice was soft but trembling as Jimin began to read. "Salvador, you don't know me, but you know people like me, mothers, grandmothers, people who trust this country with our most precious gift, our children." The people in the room began crying again. Even the judge looked away, wiping his eyes. Quietly, Jimin continued reading, his voice cracking. "My grandson believed in this country, but the country didn't protect him. They used him and then forgot him. If anyone finds this, remember one thing. The truth is not vengeance, it is healing. And healing is all we ever wanted." Jimin paused, his voice breaking. She ended with this, "If you're reading this, I hope you have the courage to speak the truth, even if it costs you everything." He carefully folded the letter and placed it on the witness stand. In that moment, Jimin was no longer just a politician. He was a man fulfilling a promise. When the session resumed, Magistrate Velasquez no longer looked like the same woman. Her confident posture had vanished. Her face was pale and her hands trembled. She slowly stood facing the room. "I thought I could live with it," her voice cracked. "I kept telling myself that the mission was a success, that the details didn't matter. But they did." The tears rolled down my cheeks. She whispered, "I changed the names. I knew my nephew wasn't fit for that mission. I panicked. I used my authority to modify the list before the deployment, thinking it would be harmless." Jimin remained still, saying nothing. Velasquez was sobbing now. "I didn't know someone else would take his place. I didn't know it would be Luis Enrique. I told myself I'd fix it later, that I'd erase the trail, but there was too much at stake. So I ran, I froze. I'm sorry," she whispered. But that wasn't enough, because millions of families across the country were watching with tears in their eyes, wishing someone had spoken up before it was too late. That afternoon, Jimin asked for one final item to be brought into the courtroom. It wasn't a file or a recording. It was a small, simple wooden chair, carefully placed beside the witness stand. "This," Jimin said softly, "is Luis Enrique's chair. His grandmother gave it to me before she passed. She said he never had the chance to sit in a room and defend himself, so give him his place." The judge nodded solemnly, and the chair remained there. For the rest of the day, everyone who testified turned slightly toward the empty chair, as if Luis Enrique were listening. Velasquez could not look at it. Every time her eyes fell on the wood, she blinked, trying to hold back her tears. Jimin turned to the cameras and said, "Let this chair remind us that behind every lie, there is a life that can never be replaced." The people cried. In living rooms, veterans and grieving families stood with their hands over their hearts. It was no longer just a chair. It was a symbol of all the voices that power tried to silence. And Jimin had made sure that one of them would never be forgotten. Just as the session seemed to be coming to an end, a child stepped timidly into the courtroom. He was about 11 years old. Nervously, he held something in his hand. He approached the judge's stand and whispered, "Can I give this to the president?" Jimin turned, surprised. The boy extended his hand with a small, worn medal hanging from a faded ribbon. "My dad died in Afghanistan," the boy said. "This was his. I watched the trial this week, and I wanted to give it to you because you fought for a soldier when no one else did." Jimin knelt down and took the medal as if it were made of crystal. His voice broke. "What's your name, kid?" he whispered. "Caleb," the boy replied. Jimin hugged him, and the cameras captured the moment. That night, the news showed that single image, a grieving child and a president kneeling to honor him. It wasn't staged, it wasn't political. It was real, and millions of people cried like they hadn't in years. They didn't cry just for the pain, they cried for dignity. Because in that moment, Jimin didn't just expose a lie. He reminded El Salvadorans of what truth looks like when it wears the face of a child. "I understand," whispered Magistrate Velasquez. But then something extraordinary happened. The same jury that had convicted her turned to Jimin. "And to you, Mr. President," they said, "we have nothing to rule, but we have much to say. Thank you." The whole room stood. The jury, the public, even the judge applauded, not in celebration, but in reverence for the truth. Jimin didn't smile. He only looked one last time at the empty chair of Luis Enrique and then turned toward the cameras. "This was never about winning," and he said. "It was about honoring a promise to a soldier, a mother, a family, and a nation that deserved to know the truth." And for a brief but powerful moment, El Salvador wept together. The room was empty now, but the echo of the truth still hung in the air. That night, as the sun set over San Salvador, a sealed envelope arrived at the National Palace. It was delivered personally by the assistant of Magistrate Velasquez. The letter contained only 2 sentences. "To the people of El Salvador, I hereby resign as Magistrate of the Supreme Court of Justice, effective immediately." Within minutes, the news spread across every newsroom in the country. Social media exploded, but Jimin didn't celebrate. Instead, he asked the press to respect the privacy of the Chavez family. "She lost a grandson, her daughter lost a son. This moment belongs to them," he said. In front of the Chavez family home, hundreds of people left flowers, letters, and candles. One note read simply, "Thank you, Jimin. Truth finally won." Velasquez's fall wasn't a victory for Jimin. It was Luis Enrique's victory that night. As Jimin sat alone, holding the medal Caleb had given him, he whispered to no one, "We didn't win. We just did the right thing." And in homes across the country, families hugged old letters, faded photographs, and cried. The next morning in a small school in Santa Tecla, a fifth-grade class gathered around a screen. Their teacher, Mrs. Enriquez, had shown them clips from the trial all week, not for politics, but for the message. She stood by the blackboard and wrote in big, careful letters, "Honor." "Who can tell me what this word means?" she asked. A little girl raised her hand. "It means telling the truth, even if it's hard," she said. "Exactly," said the teacher, wiping her eyes. "And who taught us that this week?" The entire class answered in unison, President Jimin. On the wall, next to the Salvadoran flag, a new photo of Luis Enrique Chavez, smiling in his uniform, was hung. Below it was a note written by the children. "You are not forgotten." Later that night, Jimin watched a clip of that moment. He leaned back in his chair and covered his face with his hand. He didn't cry for politics. He cried because the truth had reached the place where it mattered the most, the next generation. That night, Jimin's phone rang. He answered. "Mr. President," said the deep, steady voice of Donald Trump calling from Washington, "you didn't just expose corruption, you exposed courage. You did what very few men in history have done." Jimin didn't respond immediately. He wasn't looking for glory. "I know," Trump replied, "but the people saw you and they'll never forget you." There was a pause. "Tomorrow, I want you to give a national message," Trump added from the monument to the heroes in San Salvador. "It's time for the country to hear you, not as a politician, but as the man who did what was right." Jimin stayed silent. "Will you do it?" Trump asked. "Yes, sir," Jimin replied, "but only if I can mention one name." Trump chuckled softly. "Let me guess, Luis Enrique?" Jimin smiled sadly. "Yes, sir. Him and his mother." He hung up the phone and looked out the window. The city lights shone brightly, but the real light came from something deeper. The truth, finally illuminating. The next morning, a soft fog covered the Plaza de los Próceres. A stage had been set up in front of the monument. Surrounded by national flags, barely moved by the wind, Jimin climbed the marble steps slowly. Each step echoed as the entire nation watched. He stood in front of the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, veterans in wheelchairs, mothers holding portraits, children waving small flags. And then he began. "6 days ago, I entered a courtroom to answer an accusation. But what I discovered was not just about me. It was about all of us." He paused, then he placed Luis Enrique's photo on the podium. This young man gave everything for a country that almost forgot his name. Today we remember him, not out of anger but out of love. Love for the truth, love for what is right, love for the families who never stopped praying for someone to hear them. The camera zoomed in and his voice cracked. "If we are to heal this nation, healing must start by honoring those we've lost," Jimin said, his voice breaking. "Not with silence, but with action." In that instant, the people didn't see a politician. They saw a man in whom El Salvador could trust. When Jimin stepped down from the podium, the crowd didn't applaud. Instead, one by one, veterans, teachers, grandparents, and children kneeled in complete silence. Not in protest, but in honor of Luis Enrique, of the truth, and of the courage to speak it aloud. Jimin's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the first row, at the young Caleb, the boy who had given him the medal. Caleb stood up, placed his hand on his heart, and Jimin knelt too, not as a president, but as a father, a citizen, the son of a broken system who chose to break the silence in its place. That moment spread across every screen in the country, in small towns and big cities. People came out of their homes and knelt, not because someone asked them to, but because for the first time in a long time, they felt there was something worth kneeling for. Velasquez watched it alone, and for the first time since her resignation, she cried, not from fear, but from guilt. Because Jimin had done what she never could, he gave the power back to the people. That night, Jimin returned to San Salvador for an intimate ceremony at the Chavez family home. The old porch light of Doña Mercedes flickered as he approached, holding a small oak box in his hands. Inside, he carefully placed Caleb's medal on the mantel next to a folded Salvadoran flag and a photo of Luis Enrique in uniform. "This belongs here," Jimin whispered, remembering the people who taught him what true honor means. David Chavez, Luis Enrique's father, stood next to him, tears running freely down his face. "I used to think silence kept the pain away," David said. "But now I see that truth sets you free." Jimin nodded, struggling to hold back his emotions. "Your son changed this country, and you gave him a voice when he no longer had one." David responded quietly, "And you kept your promise." Outside, the neighbors lit candles on their doorsteps. The whole block glowed like a sea of stars. Jimin looked at the town. He hadn't planned on becoming a hero. He just couldn't walk away from a broken promise. And in doing so, he didn't just expose corruption. He redefined what it means to have courage. The next morning, Jimin returned to the presidential palace. As he descended from the presidential helicopter, Donald Trump waited for him. There were no reporters, no cameras, just a solemn handshake, and then, unexpectedly, a long embrace. "You did what no one else could do," Trump said, his voice quieter than usual. "You didn't just protect the truth. You honored the soul of this nation." Jimin nodded, still holding Luis Enrique's last letter inside his jacket. The world needed this moment, not just to expose what was wrong, but to remind us of what's worth protecting, he added quietly. Together, they walked in silence toward the presidential residence. Behind them, the Salvadoran flag flew higher than it had all week. Not for politics, but for Luis Enrique, for Lena, for Mercedes, and for every forgotten name written on crumpled letters and faded photographs that afternoon. That same day, the Legislative Assembly unanimously passed the Chavez Law, demanding full transparency regarding the missions of any fallen soldiers. It was signed by all the parties without debate. Because Jimin didn't just tell a story, he ignited a movement in the heroes' cemetery. A new memorial was quietly approved. No statues, no speeches, just a flame protected by glass. Next to it, a plaque with 12 words for the soldier whose truth was buried until a man spoke it aloud. The flame was lit by Jimin himself. By his side, David Chavez, with his hand on his shoulder, as the soft sound of the TAP's bugle played in the background. A small group gathered: Caleb, Mrs. Enriquez, Sophia the nurse, and several veterans who once testified in silence. There were no crowds, no cameras, just family. Jimin took one last step forward, pulled out Luis Enrique's final letter, and placed it under the flame. "I kept my promise," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, he cried completely, without cameras, without barriers, just grief and peace. Because he knew that this was never about revenge. It had always been about memory. On the seventh day, Jimin returned home in silence. His youngest son ran to him with a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Dad. We're proud of you." Jimin knelt, embraced him tightly, and whispered, "I just wanted to make the world a little safer for you." That night, Jimin wrote one last letter, not to the court nor to the press, but to his journal. "Let the story not end with me. Let it begin with every child who sees, hears, and believes that telling the truth, no matter the cost, is how nations rise. I entered that room to defend myself. I left defending something much greater," he wrote, closing the book. But the story never truly ended, because somewhere a mother had just tucked her son in with a little more hope. A veteran finally slept without nightmares, and a forgotten soldier was remembered by a nation that almost left him behind.